In a previous episode, we looked at post-war Finland and its unique relationship to both the Soviet Union as well as the countries of the Western Alliance. So, since we've already gone north, way north, we figured we should continue that story and fill you in on the situation in Scandinavia. Hang on to your IKEA, your AHA videos, your Elsinore castles, and even your Viking clap. Today, we are looking at the rest of the Nordic countries and their position in the post-1945 world. I'm your host David, and this is the Cold War. The Nazi occupation of Norway lasted from 1940 right to the German capitulation in May of 1945. The country was controlled by the Germans through the puppet government of Vidkun Quisling, who happened to be supported by an occupying force of no less than 400,000 German soldiers. Quisling's name, incidentally, has become synonymous with treason and collaboration. Finnmark, the northernmost region of Norway, had seen fierce fighting between the Red Army and the Wehrmacht forces there, the latter of which had been forced back, meaning that at least part of Finnmark was under Soviet occupation in late 1944, before the occupation was taken over by a force of free Norwegians who had been transported from the United Kingdom. The surrender of Germany in 1945 led to a fierce debate in Norway on how best to deal with those who had collaborated with the Nazi regime. The so-called Ice Front called for harsh and immediate penalties for anyone suspected of collaboration, while the Silk Front, who opposed them, called for punishments, but not the death penalty, as they felt it was not becoming of a civilized society. At the end of the day, although almost 29,000 people were arrested for questioning, less than 6,000 were still detained by August of 1946. Altogether, 30 death sentences were decreed, of which 25 were then carried out, including Vidkun Quisling. But now back to the immediate post-war period. The Norwegian government in exile was replaced by a coalition government led by Einar Gerhardsen until the fall of 1945, when a general election was held. Gerhardsen and his Labour government became the first elected post-war Norwegian Prime Minister, a position he retained until 1965, with a brief 3-week break in 1963. Gerhardsen and the Labour Party quickly moved to establish a market economy that was heavily regulated by the state. His governments pursued policies in favor of redistribution of wealth by means of taxation, and their social security policies decreased both unemployment and poverty rates across the country. Included in these social policies was the provision of inexpensive housing loans, a child allowance, the provision of student loans, extended unemployment insurance, 9 years of compulsory public education, a universal basic pension, and compulsory medical insurance. This deeply entrenched the concept of the social welfare state in Norwegian society and continues to have lasting effects in the country to this day. Economically, Norway made rapid advances despite the devastation of the war years. This was done by carefully balancing the production of consumer goods with large investments into heavy industries. It paid off, and even by 1946, industrial production had exceeded pre-war levels. This was further boosted by Norway's participation in the Marshall Plan, from which it received approximately $400 million in 1947. All told, by 1949, Norway had completely recovered its pre-war economic levels. Okay, so that's Norway domestically, but we all know that the Cold War had a lot to do with foreign relations. So what did Norwegian foreign policy look like? Well, at first they pursued a more neutral stance, being active in the United Nations, but preferring to avoid choosing sides in the emerging Cold War. What Norway really focused on, in fact, was developing closer ties to the other Nordic countries. A great example of this was the 1946 merger of the Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish airlines into Scandinavian Airlines. There were also less successful attempts to form a Scandinavian defense union, and even the formation of the Nordic Council took time and effort. This was largely a result of US influence, using the carrot of Marshall Plan aid, what else, to encourage Norwegian membership in a Western alliance. The 1948 Czechoslovak coup, as well as the Soviet proposal for joint ownership of the Svalbard archipelago, helped to push Norway west and it became a founding member of NATO when that alliance was formed in 1949. Of course, all that being said, Norway still issued its own conditions on NATO participation, including a total ban on nuclear weapons from Norwegian territory, as well as no permanent foreign military presence in the country. No bases for you, America. So that was Norway. But what was happening just to the east in Sweden? Sweden, unlike much of Europe, had been untouched by the ravages of the Second World War. As such, the post-war rebuilding process didn't actually need to happen there. Elections held in July 1945 resulted in the election of the Social Democrats led by Tage Erlander after 1946. Erlander remained the democratically elected leader of Sweden until 1969, quite the remarkable feat. Although the communists had done well in elections during the 1940s, gaining over 10% of the popular vote, Erlander and his Social Democrats largely deflated support for the communists by undertaking widespread social welfare policies. These policies, like in Norway, include such things as pensions, social support for children and families, public medical insurance, housing assistance, improved labor laws, expanded vacation minimums for workers, and mandatory minimum education. These social policies were funded by increasing tax rates on both businesses and citizens. Sweden, without the looming direct threat of the Soviet Union on its borders, unlike Finland, took a more active role in global foreign policy. It joined the United Nations in 1946 and pursued the formation of the Nordic Council, although that wasn't successful until 1952. By 1949, as Sweden watched the rising tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Riksdag, the national legislature, officially took a position of neutrality, characterized by the policy of non-involvement in military alliances in peace and neutrality during the war. This policy was based on three primary pillars: non-involvement in military alliances, an independent defense system, and continued public support of neutrality. As you can guess, Sweden rejected NATO membership. In the UN, it also abstained from voting regarding the Chinese intervention in the war on the Korean Peninsula, instead opting to form a commission made up of neutral states, like Switzerland, to help regulate affairs between the two Koreas. So, Sweden's neutral and that's all, right? Wrong. Sweden was officially neutral, but Swedish society, and hence its governments, tended to lean towards the West. Sweden accepted Marshall Plan aid. Sweden even participated in intelligence gathering against the Soviets, which was then shared with NATO. This was made clear to the world when in 1952, a Swedish DC-3 was shot down by the Soviet Union over the Baltic Sea while on a signals intelligence gathering mission. The Soviet Union denied involvement in the incident until 1991, after the end of the Cold War. Okay, so Swedish neutrality existed, which was clearly different from Finnish neutrality in that there was clearly a favoring of one side over the other. Now, what about Denmark? How often have most of you said those words? Now, like Norway, Denmark was occupied throughout the war years, not being liberated until May of 1945 when British troops arrived. The one exception was the island of Bornholm, east of Denmark in the Baltic Sea, whose German garrison would not surrender to the Soviet Union, insisting that their orders were to surrender to the British. The Red Army conducted a large-scale bombardment and subsequently occupied Bornholm until April of 1946. But a bit more on that in a minute. Danish elections held after their liberation resulted in a victory for the Social Democratic Party, led by Vilhelm Buhl, but the leader of the liberal Venstre Party, Knud Christensen, became the prime minister. Christensen introduced a package of social reforms called the National Social Insurance Program. This included similar social benefits introduced in both Norway and Sweden, but was notable for increasing the pension age for men from 60 to 65. Christensen also introduced the Building Subsidy Act, allowing for low-interest loans to be used for the construction of housing for low-income and vulnerable groups. Christensen was forced to resign in 1947, however, as he split from the Venstre Party over the issue of South Schleswig, which many Danes wanted to reabsorb from Germany, despite the significant ethnic German population that now lived there. In the end, South Schleswig remained a part of Germany. So, 1947. Christensen out, new elections bring the Social Democrats under Hans Hedtoft back into power. His first 3 years in office were marked by the introduction of a progressive tax rate, as well as measures designed to improve the quality of life for the disabled. Also, the Faroe Islands were granted home rule after several attempts by the Faroese to become fully independent of Denmark. 1950 saw a coalition government formed between the Venstre and Conservative parties who worked together to lower the voting age from 25 to 23 and expanded the lower house of the legislature to 179 seats, while at the same time abolishing the upper house. They also extended voting rights to the impoverished and convicts, altered the succession rules of the monarchy to allow more equal gender opportunity, as well as expanding civil rights for Danish citizens. At this point, I'm sure you're seeing a trend in Scandinavia regarding social welfare programs. So, what does Danish foreign policy look like at this time? As you might expect, it was West-leaning, especially in the face of Soviet-backed communist takeovers across Eastern Europe. Despite Denmark not being a part of the anti-Hitler coalition, the result of total occupation, they joined the United Nations in June of 1945. As well as being strong proponents of Nordic integration, Denmark also chose to participate in the Marshall Plan, using the monies provided to help build its economy and finance the establishment of its social welfare state. Denmark also became a founding member of NATO in 1949, although it did so on the understanding that no foreign bases would be established there. So, remember Bornholm Island? The Soviets in 1946 agreed to return the island to Danish control on the condition that only Danish troops could ever be present there. This was a condition that remained in effect even after they had joined NATO, and despite its key strategic position in the Baltic, Bornholm Island remained garrisoned only by the Danish military. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure that... Wait, who are you? You forgot a country. What? I forgot a country. Iceland, right, all tucked away up there. Iceland, right. When the Second World War broke out, Iceland was an independent nation, but still in a personal union with Denmark, part of the 1918 Danish-Icelandic Act of Union. So Iceland was its own country, but the Danish monarch was recognized as the official head of state. Think of it being like a member of the British Commonwealth of Nations country, like Canada for instance, where the Queen is the official head of state, but it's a ceremonial role, not a political one. So why are we talking about this? Well, because the Act of Union was set to last 25 years, taking it up to 1943. However, Denmark was conquered by the Germans in 1940. So what did Iceland, who had declared neutrality, do? Well, they declared their full independence and reasserted their neutrality. Britain, however, fearing a German takeover of the island, launched Operation Fork in May of 1940 and successfully invaded and occupied Iceland. Icelandic protests were largely ignored, and the British, and Canadian troops incidentally, stayed for the next year until an agreement was worked out with the United States that their friendly but neutral troops would replace the British troops there. Of course, when the United States joined the war on the Allied side in December of that year, their troops remained in Iceland. In 1943, the Act of Union expired, and in May of 1944, Iceland voted to officially become a republic, severing its ties to Denmark. Svein Bjørnson became Iceland's first president, a post he held through 2 elections until his death in 1952. The country pursued a Keynesian economic policy, boosted by Marshall Plan aid, but also taking advantage of the infrastructure upgrades that the US occupying forces had constructed. Those American occupation forces, which had grown into a force of tens of thousands as the war progressed, did cause strain in their relations with the Icelanders and was asked to leave in 1946, which they did as Iceland assumed local responsibility for its own defense. However, at the same time, the US was permitted to re-establish a base at Keflavik. Iceland was a founding member of NATO, despite the divide in public opinion that joining the defense treaty caused. This tension was eased somewhat by the addition of a clause for Iceland which exempted them from participation in an offensive war against a foreign nation. NATO membership, it should be pointed out, remained a contentious issue to the Icelandic left throughout the Cold War. By the early 1950s, Iceland's economy had continued to flourish, this time by means of the industrialization of their fishing fleet, a key part of Iceland's economy for the coming decades. In fact, Icelandic fishing became the center point of a dispute between NATO allies as early as 1952, which the Soviets attempted to exploit. But you know what? We'll deal with that in another episode. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button. Remember, we have merchandise available through Teespring at teespring.com/stores/thecoldwar. Pick some up and be the flashiest kolhoznik on the block. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you want to ensure that we're able to keep the lights on in our studio, please consider supporting us via Patreon at www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.